As lead manager Raskin stated, my colleagues are going to walk through the events of January 6th and the evidence in very great detail. They are painful to watch and to recount, and I'm not going to repeat the evidence now. But I do want to be clear about what also happened during that terrible attack, and that is this, that President Trump once again failed us. Because when the violence erupted, when we and the law enforcement officials protecting us, protecting you, were under attack, as each of you were being evacuated from this chamber, from a violent mob, as we were being evacuated from the House, he could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence. It was his duty as commander-in-chief to stop the violence, and he alone had that power. Not just because of his unique role as commander-in-chief, but because they believed that they were following his orders. They said so.
I thought I was following my president. I thought I was following what we were called to do.
President Trump requested that we be in D.C. on the 6th.
You heard it from them. They were doing what he wanted them to do. They wouldn't have listened to you, to me, to the Vice President of the United States, who they were attacking. They didn't stop in the face of law enforcement, police officers fighting for their lives to stop them. They were following the president. He alone, our commander-in-chief, had the power to stop it. And he didn't. You will hear evidence tonight, tomorrow, throughout the trial, about his refusal as commander-in-chief to respond to numerous desperate pleas on the phone, across social media, begging him to stop the attack. And you will see his relentless attack on Vice President Pence, who was at that very moment hiding with his family as armed extremists were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," calling him a traitor. You will see that even when he did, finally, 3.5 hours into the attack, tell these people to go home in peace, he added, as lead manager Raskin said, I'll quote, "You're very special. We love you." Think for a moment, just a moment, of the lives lost that day, of the more than 140 wounded police officers, and ask yourself if as soon as this had started, President Trump had simply gone onto TV, just logged onto Twitter and said, "Stop the attack." If he had done so with even half as much force as he said, "Stop the steal," how many lives would we have saved? Sadly, he didn't do that. At the end of the day, the president was not successful in stopping the certification. That we know, thanks to the bravery of our law enforcement and to the bravery of the senators in this room. Each of you who still fulfilled your constitutional duty, even under the threat of mortal peril. But there can be no doubt of the grave harm that he caused. To our elected leaders, to us, our families, to all who work in the Capitol, our staff, your staff, to our brave Capitol Police who defend us tirelessly with little thanks, who believed that they had a commander-in-chief who would defend and protect them and instead put them in harm's way, to those killed for heeding his command, to our democracy and the system which ensures that we have a president elected by the people, to our national security and our standing in the world. The harm was real. The damage was real. 5 people lost their lives on that terrible, tragic day. A woman was shot dead 50 feet from where we later certified the election results. And for those who question just how bad it was, criminal complaints recently unsealed by the Department of Justice are more than revealing. You'll see one of these documents on the screen. In the charging affidavit of one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, we learned that members of this group said, I'm going to quote, they would have killed Mike Pence if given the chance. In another, we learned of a tweet in real time while they were in the building stating, we broke into the Capitol. We got inside. We did our part. We were looking for Nancy Pelosi to shoot her in the frickin' brain, but we didn't find her. And for anyone who suggests otherwise, these defendants themselves have told you exactly why they were here. You'll see this in the trial. That in the halls of the Capitol, on social media, in news interviews, and in charging documents, they confirm they were following the president's orders. You can see some of the statements on that screen. One who said, Trump wants all able-bodied patriots. Another, that President Trump is calling us to fight. This isn't a joke. Another one, I thought I was following my president. I thought I was following what we were called to do. Our president wants us here. We wait and take orders from the president. He made them believe over many weeks that the election was stolen and they were following his command to take back their country. As I prepared for yesterday, this trial, there's one memory that I couldn't shake, which was on the night of January 6th, and the feeling of walking back onto the House floor and seeing many of you there. I remember us finishing our task at 4 a.m. And as I walked off the floor, I was so grateful for the opportunity to thank the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, for his actions, for standing before us and asking us to follow our oath and our faith and our duty. We only got a couple of hours of sleep that morning. Early the next day, I called my dad, who came to this country, as I mentioned, as an immigrant 40 years ago. And I told him that the proudest moment by far of serving in Congress for me was going back onto the floor with each of you to finish the work that we had started. I'm humbled to be back with you today. And just as on January 6th, when we overcame that attack on our capital, on our country, I'm hopeful that at this trial, we can use our resolve and our resilience to again uphold our democracy by faithfully applying the law, vindicating the Constitution, and holding President Trump accountable for his actions.
Senators, Representatives Joaquin Castro and Eric Swalwell will now showed the evidence of President Trump's long campaign to delegitimize his electoral defeat and to galvanize his supporters to help him retain his power at any cost. So we're going to go at this point step by step and explain the progression all the way up until the attack.
Good afternoon, y'all. My name is Joaquin Castro, and I represent San Antonio in the United States Congress. There's a saying that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put on its shoes. And that was before the internet. The point of that saying is that a lie can do incredible damage and destruction. And that's especially true when that lie is told by the most powerful person on earth, our Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. This attack did not come from one speech, and it didn't happen by accident. The evidence shows clearly that this mob was provoked over many months by Donald J. Trump. And if you look at the evidence, his purposeful conduct, you'll see that the attack was foreseeable and preventable. I'll start by discussing President Trump's actions leading up to the election, when he set up his big lie. Beginning in the spring of 2020, President Trump began to fall behind in the polls. And by July, President Trump had reached a new low. He was running 15 points behind his opponent. And he was scared. He began to believe that he could legitimately lose the election. And so he did something entirely unprecedented in the history of our nation. He refused to commit to a peaceful transition of power. Here's what he said.
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the election?
I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no.
Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transfer of
We
power?
want to get rid of the ballots, and you'll have a very we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
Senators, the President of the United States said, quote, "There won't be a transition of power. There'll be a continuation." President Trump was given every opportunity to tell his supporters, yes, if I lose, I will peacefully transfer power to the next president. Instead, he told his supporters the only way he could lose the election is if it was stolen. In tweet after tweet, he made sweeping allegations about election fraud that couldn't possibly be true. But that was the point. He didn't care if the claims were true. He wanted to make sure that his supporters were angry, like the election was being ripped away from them. On May 24th, 6 months before the election, he tweeted, "It will be the greatest rigged election in history." How could he possibly know it would be the greatest rigged election in history 6 months before the election happened? And on June 22nd, more of the same. Rigged 2020 election. It will be the scandal of our times. Again, about an election that had not even happened. On July 30th, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. Again, just big words with nothing to prove them. But he wanted to make his supporters believe that an election victory would be stolen from him and from them. And this was to rile up his base, to make them angry. Now, these were just a few of the many times President Trump tweeted about this. And he did it in speeches, in rallies, and in television, too.
This is going to be the greatest election disaster in history. Because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. That's right. It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
But this will be one of the greatest fraudulent and most fraudulent elections ever.
This is clearly a man who refuses to accept the possibility or the reality in our democracy of losing an election. And there are dozens more tweets and speeches of Donald Trump spreading his lie, but you get the point. His supporters got the point as well. They firmly believe that if he lost, it was because the election was rigged.
Will you accept the result if Joe Biden wins?
No.
Under any circumstance?
No.
Why is that?
Because it's lies and deceit and corruption.
Do you think that if we get to election night or in the following days, if Biden winds up somehow becoming the winner, do you think it's rigged?
Oh, yes. Very much so.
Election night?
Yes.
Days after. If it shows up that Joe Biden won?
Yes.
In your opinion, would that be the only way that Trump could lose, that it'd be a rigged election? Is that the only way Joe Biden can win?
Absolutely. I agree with that because there's no way in heck our president's going to lose. But yes, it would be a rigged election. There's some type of cheating went on, what have you. And I firmly believe that.
Now, all of us in this room have run for election, and it's no fun to lose. I'm a Texas Democrat. We've lost a few elections over the years. But can you imagine telling your supporters that the only way you could possibly lose is if an American election was rigged and stolen from you? And ask yourself whether you've ever seen anyone at any level of government make the same claim about their own election. But that's exactly what President Trump did. He truly made his base believe that the only way he could lose was if the election was rigged. And senators, all of us know and all of us understand how dangerous that is for our country. Because the most combustible thing you can do in a democracy is convince people that an election doesn't count, that their voice and their vote don't count, and that it's all been stolen, especially if what you're saying are lies. Let us turn now to the election. As you know, the results were not fully reported on election night, which is not unusual in our nation's history. But by November 7th, major news networks, including Fox News, reported that once the remaining votes were counted, Joe Biden would be the likely victor. So President Trump began urging his supporters to stop the count. I would imagine that if we went around this room, there are folks sitting here that started down on election night and ended up coming back up and winning their races. Perhaps that's why some of you are seated in this room today. But imagine if you were behind and the results start coming in, and as you started pulling ahead, your opponent said, "That's not fair. Stop the count while I'm still ahead." That's what Donald Trump did. But that's not how America works. Here, every vote counts. You don't just stop counting when one person is ahead. We count every vote. And let's be clear. President Trump knew that you can't just stop counting votes, but he wanted to inflame his base. There was a purpose behind this, to truly make them believe that counting votes would result in a stolen, rigged election. He said at 12:49 a.m. on election night, quote, "They're trying to steal the election. We will never let them do it." A little over an hour later, at roughly 2:30 in the morning, before all the votes were even close to being counted. He goes even further and actually declares victory. Take a look.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Frankly, we did win. Rather than calmly saying, let's count the votes. If there's legal issues, we'll go to court and we'll resolve them. Instead, he told his supporters that he actually won the election and the whole thing was a fraud. He said that on November 4th, and he has never recounted that statement since. Despite President Trump's pressure at the time, election officials around the country continued to carry out their duties. And as votes were counted and his loss became more certain, he riled up his base further. Take a look at these tweets. On November 5th, he tweeted in all capital letters, as if shouting commands, quote, "Stop the count. Stop the fraud." Senators, this is dangerous. I also want you to remember these tweets for another reason. Because that's what it looks like when Donald Trump wants people to stop doing something. And bear in mind, this is not the president saying to his supporters that somebody stole your cup of coffee. This is the commander-in-chief telling his supporters, your election is being stolen and you must stop the counting of American votes. And it worked. His words became their actions. His commands led to their actions. Take a look at this. The same day as those tweets, around 100 Trump supporters showed up in front of the Maricopa County Election Center in Phoenix, some of them carrying rifles, literally trying to intimidate officials to stop the count, just as President Trump had commanded. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs said that protesters were, quote, causing delay and disruption and preventing those employees from doing their job. Let's call this what it was. We're facing a global pandemic. Workers were risking their health to ensure the integrity of our elections. And President Trump's supporters were encircling them, trying to prevent them from doing their own jobs. This was dangerous, it was scary, and it was a blatant act of political intimidation. In Philadelphia, that same day, police investigated an alleged plot to attack the city's Pennsylvania Convention Center, where votes were being counted. Police took at least one man into custody who was carrying a weapon. And this happened all over. In Atlanta, in Detroit, and in Milwaukee. His supporters used armed force to try to disrupt lawful counting of votes because they bought into Trump's big lie that the election was stolen from them. President Trump's months of inflaming and inciting his supporters had worked. They believed it was their duty to quite literally fight to stop the count, so they showed up at election centers across the country to do just that.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
They ain't taking it from us.
We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret
destroyed because America is rising.
And there it is. They had bought into his big lie. President Trump told his supporters over and over again, nearly every day, in dozens of tweets, speeches, and rallies, that their most precious right in our democracy, their voice, their vote, was being stripped away, and they had to fight to stop that. And they believed him, and so they fought. And you may say, well, he didn't know that they'd take up arms. But when he did know, when it was all over the news, President Trump didn't stop. As Mr. Swalwell will show, after Donald Trump lost, he became even more desperate and incited his base even further. He urged them again and again, with increasingly forceful language, to fight to stop the steal. And even as the certification got closer and he grew even more desperate, he gave them specific instructions on how, where, and when to fight to stop the steal. He told them to show up on January 6th and march to the U.S. Capitol to stop the certification of the election results. And he told them to come here and fight like hell. You will see clearly that this violent mob that showed up here on January 6th didn't come out of thin air. President Donald John Trump incited this violence. And that's the truth.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, my name is Eric Swalwell and I represent California's 15th Congressional District. Manager Castro just told you about Donald Trump's lies and acts before the election. But, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, that wasn't the end of his efforts. That wasn't the beginning of the end. But perhaps it was the end of the beginning. Here's what I mean. You saw President Trump prime for months his supporters to believe that if the election was lost, it only could have been so because it was rigged. But that took time. Just like to build a fire, it doesn't just start with the flames. Donald Trump, for months and months, assembled the tinder, the kindling, threw on logs for fuel to have his supporters believe that the only way their victory would be lost was if it was stolen. So that way, President Trump was ready, if he lost the election, to light the match. And on November 7, after all the votes were counted, President Trump did lose by 7 million votes. But for Donald Trump, all was not lost. He had a backup plan. Instead of accepting the results or pursuing legitimate claims, he told his base more lies. He doused the flames with kerosene. And this wasn't just some random guy at the neighborhood bar blowing off steam. This was our commander-in-chief. Day after day, he told his supporters false, outlandish lies that the victory, that the election outcome was taken and it was rigged. And he had absolutely no support for his claims. But that wasn't the point. He wanted to make his base angrier and angrier. And to make them angry, he was willing to say anything. On November 15, he states, "I concede nothing. We have a long way to go. Rigged election." Doesn't say why the election is rigged. November 17, in a Twitter statement, "Dead people voted." That's it. No evidence, just dead people voted. November 28, Twitter statement, "We have found many illegal votes. Stay tuned." This just wasn't true. He never found illegal votes. He didn't even try to pretend that he had evidence for that. And stay tuned, well, that was all about inciting his base, not about bringing legitimate claims. It was about dramatizing the election to anger his supporters. December 5, you see here, he goes after the governors of Arizona and Georgia, governors from his own party, claiming that they weren't with him. You see, senators, he is casting this in combat terms, that either you are with him, making sure that he won the election, or you're fighting against him. These are just a few of the hundreds of Twitter statements that President Trump sent. And it wasn't just Twitter statements. As you'll see, he was dialing into meetings, holding rallies, appearing on television, continuing to spread the big lie that his election victory was stolen.
People that were dead were signing up for ballots. Not only were they coming in and putting in a ballot, but dead people were requesting ballots. And they were dead for years, and they were requesting ballots.
Dead people voting all over the place? The alleged Biden margin of victory in several states is entirely accounted for by extraordinarily large midnight vote dumps. You saw them with going up to the sky.
Massive midnight vote dumps. Dead people voting all over the place. He said there were votes going up to the sky. This was never about pursuing legitimate claims. He was saying anything he could to trigger and anger his base so that they would fight like hell to overturn a legitimate election. And it worked. Just as Manager Castro showed you, President Trump's supporters were taking up arms to stop the count. His message to fight like hell was having real consequences. In Michigan, you'll recall that President Trump was attacking that state and its officials. He continued these attacks even after Michigan certified its votes.
Take a look at Michigan. Take a look at what they did with respect to counties. And then you get to Detroit, and it's like more votes than people? Dead people voting all over the place? You know, I won almost every county in Michigan, almost every district. We should have won that state very easily. We have a similar type of governor, I think, but I'll let you know that in about a week.
He's literally telling them that there were more votes in Detroit than people. About 260,000 people voted in Detroit. There are roughly 500,000 registered voters in Detroit. There are approximately 670,000 people living in the city. So again, not true. But he needed to make these outlandish claims to truly make his supporters believe that their victory was stolen from them. And it was working. A few days after these clips, on December 5, his supporters surrounded the Michigan Secretary of State's home.
Secretary of State's house and the steal. Stop the steal! 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 You're a threat to democracy! You're a threat to free and honest elections!
9 o'clock at night, Secretary's family's inside. Protesters have surrounded her home, and they're chanting that she's a felon. And as we saw, when armed protesters showed up to follow President Trump's direction to stop the steal, this was not the first time that President Trump's supporters used threats and intimidation. President Trump cannot say, "I didn't know what I was inciting." From what Manager Castro showed and what I just showed, there was plenty of evidence that his words had consequences. And if he wanted to stop it, he could stop it. You saw Mr. Castro read statement after statement from our commander-in-chief saying, "Stop the count, stop the steal." President Trump was never shy about using his platforms to try and stop something. He could have very easily told his supporters, "Stop threatening officials, stop going to their homes, stop it with the threats." But each time he didn't. Instead, in the face of escalating violence, he incited them further. The next phase in the certification of results was the certification on December 14 of the Electoral College votes. The night before, President Trump personally issued 14 Twitter statements with more false claims about the election being stolen and directing his supporters to make sure that, quote, "they cannot be certified." He states here, the rhinos that run the state voting apparatus have caused us the problem of allowing the Democrats to so blatantly cheat in their attempt to steal the election, which we won overwhelmingly. We will never give up. In the face of threats to elected officials, this is his message. And he calls them rhinos, Republicans in name only, and tells them to never give up. President Trump, to him, it was his supporters against anyone who would not overturn the election results so that President Trump could win. But on December 14, despite all of President Trump's efforts to stop, the electors cast their votes according to the will of the American people, and Joe Biden was certified as having won 306 Electoral College votes. The day after this occurred, Leader McConnell recognized this, stating, "Many of us hoped that the presidential election would yield a different result. But our system of government has processes to determine who will be sworn in on January 20. The Electoral College has spoken." As Manager Castro said, no one here, no one among us wants to lose an election. Sometimes there's a reason to dispute an election. Sometimes the count is close. Sometimes we ask for a recount or we go to court. That's entirely appropriate. But what President Trump did was different. What President Trump did was the polar opposite of what any of us would do if we lost an election. Because once the outcome is clear and a judge rules, we concede. We recognize the will of the American people because we let the people decide. And that's what all of the courts, the Justice Department, and the 50 states that had counted the votes, they said it was time for a peaceful transition of power because that's what our Constitution and rule of law demands. Except President Trump. He directed all of the rage that he had incited to January 6th. That was his last chance to stop the peaceful transition of power. And that brings us to the attack. Manager Castro told you the power of the lie, especially when the lie comes from the most powerful person in the world, the commander-in-chief. It also helps if you spend millions of dollars to amplify that lie. You'll see here, in mid-December, President Trump announced the release of ads, including ones entitled, "The evidence is overwhelming," "Fraud," "Stop the steal." He spent $50 million from his legal defense fund on these ads to stop the steal and amplify his message. They were released nationally, played in video ads, online advertising, and targeted text messages. They used the same words and phrases that President Trump had been spreading for months, that the election was full of fraud, to stop the steal. But now they had a specific purpose. How do we know that purpose? These ads were designed to run all the way up to January 5, and then they stopped. This was purposeful and deliberate planning to target his base to rally around that day. And it wasn't just his ads. He continued to use his own platform. He told his supporters, who truly believed their victory had been stolen and who were ready to fight when, where, and how to stop what he believed was a steal. Donald Trump would issue a deliberate call to action. And just like in his ads, that action centered around January 6th. On December 19, at 1:42 in the morning, our commander-in-chief tweeted, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild. Will be wild." We know why he picked this day. It wasn't random. It was his last chance to stop a peaceful transition of power. And he gave his supporters plenty of time to plan. This was the save the date, sent out 18 days before the event on January 6th. And it wasn't a casual one-off reference or a single invitation. For the next 18 days, Donald Trump would make sure to remind them over and over and over to show up on January 6th. And he would tell them exactly what he wanted them to do. On December 26, he tweets, "If a Democrat presidential candidate had an election rigged and stolen, with proof of such acts at a level never seen before, the Democrat senators would consider it an act of war and fight to the death. Mitch and the Republicans do nothing, just want to let it pass. No fight." He's saying that the Republicans are doing nothing and have no fight because you are doing your job, taking on the constitutional process of certifying the Electoral College results. And he also suggests, President Trump, that if this was the reverse and the Democrats had lost, it would be an act of war. An act of war. That's how Donald Trump prepared his supporters for January 6th. He even stated again 14 minutes later to make sure his supporters understood, quote, "The Justice Department and the FBI have done nothing about the 2020 presidential election voter fraud, the biggest scam, all caps, in our nation's history, despite overwhelming evidence. They should be ashamed." And then he adds, "History will remember. Never give up. See everyone in D.C. on January 6th. That phrase, history will remember, was the first time Donald Trump had used it in his presidency. And he sent this to 70+ million Twitter followers the day they needed to show up and be ready to fight. On December 27, he reminds them again, don't miss it. Information to follow. A few days later, December 30, all caps, see you in D.C. This continues all the way up to January 6. On January 1, he states, the big protest rally in Washington will take place at 11 a.m. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal. You'll see that an hour later, President Trump retweeted one of his Twitter followers. That follower was Kylie Kremer, Executive Director of Women for America First, the group organizing the January 6th rally and the creator of the Facebook group Stop the Steal. Kremer tweeted, quote, "The cavalry is coming, Mr. President," referring to the cavalry showing up on January 6th. She also added a website for supporters to RSVP and made clear what the message was. #StopTheSteal. And what did President Trump say in response to hearing that the cavalry was coming? "A great honor," he wrote back. This wasn't just a single tweet. He and his organizers would do this over and over repeatedly. On January 3, another supporter tweets, "We have been marching all around the country for you, Mr. President. Now we will bring it to D.C. on January 6 and proudly stand beside you. Thank you for fighting for us." When President Trump reposted her tweet, she wrote back, "Best day ever. Thank you for the retweet. It has been an honor to stand up and fight for you and our nation. We will be standing strong on January 6th in D.C. with you. We are bringing the cavalry, Mr. President. We are bringing the cavalry." That was the consistent message. This was not just any old protest. President Trump was inciting something historic. The cavalry was coming. And he was organized. In her post, Ms. Lawrence tagged Kylie Kremer, the organizer of the event, whose post we just saw President Trump retweet. Again, you see, this is all connected. I won't show you all of the Twitter statements, and there are a lot, but here's one more. President Trump retweeted another of Ms. Kremer's posts, which had all the details of January 6th with the same hashtags: March for President Trump, do not certify, stop the steal. And in response, President Trump, he writes back, "I will be there. Historic day." Before Congress, I prosecuted violent crimes in California as an Alameda County Deputy District Attorney. And when you investigate and prosecute violent crimes, you have to distinguish. Was this a heat of passion crime, or was it something more deliberate, planned, premeditated? The evidence here on this count is overwhelming. President Trump's conduct leading up to January 6th was deliberate, planned, and premeditated. This was not one speech, not one tweet. It was dozens in rapid succession with the specific details. He was acting as part of the host committee. In fact, when he had assembled his inflamed mob in D.C., he warned us that he knew what was coming. This was President Trump's statement the night before the attack. I should say this was one of his dozens of statements on Twitter in the hours leading up to the attack. I hope the Democrats, and even more importantly, the weak and ineffective rhino section of the Republican Party, are looking at the thousands of people pouring into D.C. They won't stand for a landslide victory to be stolen. At Senate Majority Leader, at John Cornyn, at Senator John Thune. Thousands of people pouring into D.C. who won't stand for the landslide election to be stolen. It's all right there. And he tags senators to pressure you to stop this. And he warns all of us that his thousands of supporters, whom you'll see that the FBI had warned were armed and targeting the Capitol, won't stand for us certifying the results of the election. This was never about one speech. He built this mob over many months with repeated messaging until they believed that they had been robbed of their vote and they would do anything to stop the certification. He made them believe that their victory was stolen and incited them so he could use them to steal the election for himself.
This election was rigged.
This is tyranny against the people of the United States, and we are not standing for it anymore.
If we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taken place in our 2020 election, We don't have a country anymore.
The left lies, they cheat and they steal. They are ruthless and they are hell-bent on getting power and control by any means necessary.
You Chris, take 3 steps back. Move back.
Can't let it happen. Can't let it happen.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
The Democrats are trying to steal the White House. You cannot let them.
Can't let it happen. Never concede. Fight, he told them in speech after speech. These crowds were ready to fight. This is what President Trump was inciting. He foresaw what was coming, and this is what he deliberately led to our doorstep on January 6th. I want to be clear. During this trial, when we talk about the violent mob during the attack, we do not mean every American who showed up at President Trump's rally. Certain Americans came to protest peacefully, as is their right. That is what makes our country so great, to debate freely, openly, and peacefully our differences, just like all of you were attempting to do in this very room on January 6th. But what President Trump did was different. He didn't tell his supporters to fight or be strong in a casual reference. He repeatedly, over months, told them to fight for a specific purpose. He told them their victory was stolen, the election was rigged, and their patriotic duty was to fight to stop the steal. And he repeated this messaging even after he saw the violence it was inciting. And when they were primed and angry and ready to fight, he escalated and channeled their rage with a call to arms. Show up on January 6th. At the exact time the votes of the American people were being counted and certified, and then march to the Capitol and fight like hell. He told this to thousands of people who were armed to the teeth, targeting us and determined to stop the Electoral College count. What our commander-in-chief did was wildly different from what anyone here in this room did to raise election concerns. This was a deliberate, premeditated incitement to his base to attack our Capitol while the counting was going on. And it was foreseeable, especially to President Trump, who warned us he knew what was coming. This is what the evidence has overwhelmingly shown and will show in this trial. And it's also the truth.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for a 15-minute break.
Without objection, so ordered.